5 minutes, one of his friends said with a grin, tapping the edge of the restaurant menu. That's all she'll last before she walks out. The table erupted in quiet laughter, the kind that tried to stay polite inside a nice place with white tablecloths and soft jazz humming through the ceiling speakers. But Daniel Carter didn't laugh with them. He simply leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, calm, steady, the way a man looks when he has already lived through harder things than a bad joke. Outside the tall glass windows of the downtown Atlanta restaurant, traffic slid slowly past in long ribbons of red brake lights, and the late evening air carried the glow of street lamps across the pavement. Daniel glanced down at his watch, a simple black watch with a scratched face he had worn for years, and shook his head slightly. "You guys really set this whole thing up?" he asked quietly. Across from him, Marcus, the loudest of the group, shrugged with a playful smile. "Come on, man. It's not like that. We just thought you deserved a night out. Blind date. Nothing serious." But everyone at the table knew the truth. They had seen the profile photo. Olivia Grant, venture capitalist, private school graduate, the kind of woman whose world usually existed 20 floors above the streets Daniel spent his days working on school buses. The joke wasn't cruel, exactly, but it carried the kind of curiosity people sometimes had when they wondered what would happen if two completely different worlds collided in the same room. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, not angry, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. His hands were rough from years of turning wrenches, tightening bolts, lifting engine covers heavier than most office desks, and he rested those hands on the table as if grounding himself. "You realize," he said calmly, "I woke up at 5 this morning to get my kid ready for school before work. I'm running on coffee and about 4 hours of sleep." A few of the guys shifted in their seats, their laughter softening. Daniel wasn't a man who complained often, and when he spoke plainly, people tended to listen. The restaurant door opened then with a gentle chime, letting in a breath of cool evening air. Daniel didn't look up immediately. He was still staring at the reflection of the hanging lights in his water glass, watching the small ripples settle. But the table went quiet, completely quiet. One of his friends muttered under his breath, almost impressed, "Well, she actually came." Daniel lifted his eyes. The woman standing near the entrance didn't rush, didn't scan the room nervously the way most blind dates did. She paused for a moment like someone measuring a room before stepping into it. Tall posture, dark coat draped neatly over her arm, confidence that didn't need attention to exist. Olivia Grant looked around once. Then her gaze landed directly on Daniel. Something in her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as if she had already decided something before walking over. Daniel stood slowly out of habit, the way his mother had taught him years ago in a small apartment kitchen, respect first, always. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The soft music continued playing above them. Silverware clinked somewhere across the dining room, and Daniel noticed something unexpected. She wasn't looking at his worn jacket or the grease marks still faintly lining his knuckles. She was looking directly at his eyes, calm and curious, like she was trying to understand a story before anyone had spoken a single word. Daniel gave a small nod, steady and sincere, then said the one sentence that made the entire table fall silent again. "Before we sit down, I should probably warn you. My life is a lot less impressive than whatever story they told you to get you here tonight." Olivia did not laugh at Daniel's warning, and she did not look offended either. Instead, she studied him for a moment the way someone reads the first page of a book before deciding whether the story is worth finishing. The soft lighting from the hanging fixtures above the table reflected gently off the polished surface of the restaurant floor, and for a few seconds the noise of the room seemed to fade into the background. Daniel noticed the small details first because that was how his mind worked. Years of repairing engines had trained him to observe everything before touching anything. Her coat was simple but expensive. Her shoes were clean despite the wet sidewalk outside. Her posture was straight without being stiff. But none of those things were what held his attention. It was the way she answered him. "Then I am glad you warned me," she said calmly, her voice even and steady. Because impressive stories are usually the boring ones. A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the table. One of Daniel's friends coughed awkwardly and pretended to look at the menu again. Another leaned back in his chair as if he had just realized the evening might not follow the script they had imagined. Daniel pulled the chair out for her without saying anything, and she sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The waiter passed by with a tray of glasses, and the faint sound of ice shifting inside the cups echoed softly as he walked past. Daniel folded his hands again on the table, his rough knuckles resting against the white cloth. He was not the kind of man who rushed conversation, especially not with someone who had walked into a situation that clearly was not her idea. "My son is 8 years old," he said finally, as if continuing a thought that had started before she arrived. "His name is Marcus Jr. He has soccer practice 3 days a week, and he eats more cereal than any human being I have ever met." Olivia listened without interrupting. There was no forced smile, no polite nodding meant to hurry him along. She simply listened. Daniel continued in the same calm tone. "I work at a school transportation garage about 15 minutes from here. I repair engines and keep the buses running so the kids can get to class on time. It is not glamorous work, but it pays the bills." One of the men at the table shifted again, suddenly aware that the joke date had become something else entirely. Daniel glanced briefly toward them and then back at Olivia. "I do not own a suit that costs more than $200, he added with a faint hint of humor. "And most nights I fall asleep on the couch before 10 o'clock because my kid insists we watch cartoons together." Olivia leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows gently near the edge of the table. Her expression had softened, but not in the way people sometimes did when they felt sorry for someone. This was something different. Curiosity, respect, interest that did not feel forced. "That actually sounds like a very full life," she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow, surprised by the answer. Across the table, Marcus tried to hide a grin while another friend looked completely confused. Daniel studied Olivia again, searching for the hint of sarcasm that often hid inside polite words, but he did not find it. Her eyes were clear and direct. For the first time that evening, the tension around the table loosened slightly, like a knot that had been pulled tight beginning to relax. Daniel let out a small breath and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said slowly, "that is good to hear. Because that life is exactly what you would be signing up for if this was anything more than the strange setup my friends apparently arranged tonight." Olivia did not answer Daniel immediately after his last sentence, and that silence said more than any quick response could have. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm. A server refilled a nearby glass of water. Someone at a distant table laughed softly. Outside the tall windows, a city bus rolled past, its headlights gliding across the polished floor for a moment before disappearing back into the night. Olivia rested her hands gently on the table, her fingers loosely interlaced, and she looked at Daniel the same way she had since the beginning of the evening, steady and attentive. "It would not be the strangest life I have ever considered," she said at last. The answer surprised more than just Daniel. Marcus nearly choked on the sip of water he had just taken and coughed quietly into his napkin. Another friend leaned back in his chair and stared at Olivia as if he had just heard someone volunteer to move to the moon. Daniel, however, did not laugh. He simply tilted his head slightly, studying her expression again the way a mechanic studies the sound of an engine before deciding what might be wrong with it. "You realize my son and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment over a hardware store," he said calmly. "The ceiling fan makes a clicking sound every time it rotates, and the elevator breaks down about once a month." Olivia nodded as if he had just described the weather. "I lived in a college dorm with 6 roommates once," she replied. "The hot water disappeared every morning before 8 o'clock. I learned to shower very quickly." That answer earned a few confused glances from the men at the table. The version of Olivia Grant they had imagined did not include cold showers or cramped hallways. Daniel noticed that too. His eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious but thoughtful. "Your friends here," he said slowly, gesturing lightly toward the group around them, "seem to think tonight is some kind of experiment." Marcus shifted in his chair again, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the tablecloth. Olivia glanced briefly toward the group and then back to Daniel. "They do enjoy their experiments," she admitted. "But I am not here for that." Daniel leaned forward just a little, resting his forearms on the table. The warm overhead lights caught the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, the kind that came from years of early mornings and late nights helping a child with homework after a long day of work. "Then why are you here?" he asked simply. Olivia did not hesitate this time. 3 Saturdays ago," she said, "I was walking through Piedmont Park after a meeting downtown. There was a father teaching his son how to kick a soccer ball near the fountain." Daniel blinked once, surprised by the sudden shift in the conversation. Olivia continued in the same calm voice. The boy missed the ball almost every time. And every time he missed, his father smiled and told him to try again. Daniel's friends slowly stopped moving. Even the quiet clink of glasses around the table seemed to fade for a moment. Daniel looked down briefly at his hands and then back up at her. "You were there," he said quietly, more statement than question. Olivia nodded once. "I was there." Daniel leaned back again in his chair, the memory settling slowly into place. A warm Saturday afternoon. A small soccer ball rolling across the grass. Marcus Jr. laughing every time he tripped over his own feet. Daniel exhaled softly, realizing that the evening had just become something none of them had expected. Daniel did not speak for several seconds after Olivia finished her sentence. The memory was clear in his mind now, sharper than he expected. The late afternoon sun across the grass. Marcus Jr. running in wide circles around the fountain because he kept missing the ball. Daniel remembered laughing every time the boy tried to kick with too much enthusiasm and nearly spun himself onto the ground. He had not noticed anyone watching that day. The park had been full of people, families walking dogs, teenagers riding bicycles, couples sitting on benches. It never occurred to him that someone like Olivia Grant might have been standing just a few yards away observing the moment quietly. Daniel rested his hands again on the edge of the table and shook his head once, slowly. "You watched us play soccer," he said. Olivia nodded gently. "For almost 20 minutes, she replied. One of Daniel's friends leaned forward, confused. "Wait a second," Marcus said, glancing between them. "You were telling me the reason you showed up tonight is because you saw him at a park?" Olivia turned toward him briefly, her expression calm but firm. "I am saying that I saw something most people overlook." The table fell quiet again. Daniel studied her face carefully. He had spent years learning how to read people quickly. When you raise a child alone, you develop an instinct for sincerity because your time and your trust are limited. There was no mockery in her voice. No hint that she had arrived for entertainment. Only a quiet certainty that made the room feel different. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, thinking through the situation piece by piece. "You could have walked over and said hello that day," he said. Olivia smiled faintly. "You were teaching your son how to aim his kick. He missed the ball at least 15 times. A small laugh escaped Daniel before he could stop it. "That sounds about right." Olivia continued in the same calm tone. "But every time he missed, you told him the same thing." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "And what was that?" Olivia looked directly at him. "You told him that learning something new always looks messy at the beginning." Marcus blinked in surprise. One of the other men at the table slowly leaned back as if realizing that the entire evening had changed direction without anyone noticing when it happened. Daniel looked down briefly at the tablecloth, remembering the exact moment she described. The soccer ball rolling across the grass. His son looking frustrated. The small voice asking if he would ever get better at it. Daniel had simply shrugged and told him the truth. Olivia folded her hands together again and added quietly, "You did not sound embarrassed. You did not sound impatient. You sounded proud." Daniel looked back up at her. Outside the window, a car passed slowly, headlights drifting across the restaurant walls like moving reflections on water. "A lot of parents are proud of their kids," he said. Olivia nodded once. "Yes," she said softly. "But not many make patience look that natural." Daniel remained quiet for a long moment after Olivia finished speaking, and the silence that followed felt different from the earlier pauses. It was heavier, thoughtful, as if everyone at the table was slowly realizing that the evening had shifted far beyond the harmless joke they had planned. Daniel looked down at his hands again, the rough skin along his knuckles catching the warm light above the table, and he rubbed his thumb slowly across the edge of his watch. It was a habit he had developed during long days in the garage while thinking through complicated repairs. Across from him, Olivia waited patiently, not pushing the conversation forward, not trying to fill the silence with polite chatter. She seemed comfortable letting the moment breathe. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair and released a quiet breath through his nose. "You know," he said slowly, "most people who see us at the park think I am just another tired father trying to keep up with a kid who has too much energy." Olivia tilted her head slightly. "And you are not." Daniel smiled faintly. "Oh, I definitely am that. Marcus Jr. wakes up at 6:30 every morning, even on weekends. I have tried to convince him that sleeping until 8 is a beautiful life skill, but he has not agreed yet. A few quiet laughs circled the table, though they sounded different now. Less like people waiting for a joke, and more like people settling into a story they did not expect. Daniel continued, his voice calm and steady. But that day you saw us at the park was actually the first time he tried soccer after his mother moved away. The sentence landed softly, but its meaning settled heavily in the air. Marcus looked up quickly, surprised. One of the other men shifted uncomfortably, realizing he had never asked Daniel many questions about the quiet parts of his life. Olivia's expression did not change in a dramatic way, but her attention sharpened. Daniel noticed it immediately. She moved to another state 2 years ago, he explained simply. New job, new life. Marcus Jr. stayed with me. Olivia nodded slowly, absorbing the information without offering pity. Daniel appreciated that. What he disliked most was the look people sometimes gave him when they heard the phrase single father, the look that assumed something must be broken inside his life. That first soccer practice was rough, Daniel continued. He was nervous, did not want to join the other kids, kept saying he was going to mess everything up. Daniel glanced briefly toward the window where the reflection of the restaurant lights shimmered against the glass. So, I told him we would practice in the park until he felt ready. Olivia spoke quietly. And you made missing the ball look like progress. Daniel looked back at her with a small nod. Because it was. Around the table the earlier tension had completely dissolved, replaced by a quiet curiosity none of Daniel's friends could hide anymore. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Man, he said under his breath, I really thought tonight was just going to be 5 awkward minutes. Daniel glanced at him with a calm expression. Life rarely follows the plans people make for it. Olivia smiled softly at that. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice thoughtful but certain. And sometimes the most interesting stories begin when people assume there is nothing special to see. For a few seconds after Olivia spoke, the table fell into a kind of quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if everyone present understood that the evening had crossed an invisible line. The restaurant lights glowed softly above them, reflecting in the polished silverware and the glasses of water that had barely been touched since the conversation began. Outside, the city of Atlanta continued moving without noticing the small moment unfolding behind the tall windows. Daniel watched the reflections in the glass for a moment before turning his attention back to Olivia. There was something steady about the way she sat there, something patient that did not feel forced. Most people, he knew, would have tried to change the subject by now. Talking about family struggles or life choices at a dinner table full of strangers was not exactly considered light conversation. But Olivia did not shift away from it. She simply listened. Daniel rested his hands on the table again and spoke in the same calm tone he had used all evening. Marcus Jr. thinks I am some kind of expert at everything, he said. Last week he asked me if I knew how airplanes stay in the sky. A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. I repaired diesel engines. I had to admit that airplanes are a little outside my skill set. Olivia smiled as well, but her attention remained thoughtful. What did you tell him? She asked. Daniel leaned back slightly, remembering the moment. I told him the truth, he said. I said I do not know everything, but I can always learn. The words hung gently in the air. Marcus glanced toward one of the other men at the table, as if silently admitting that none of them had expected the evening to unfold like this. What had started as a playful setup now felt like a conversation that none of them wanted to interrupt. Olivia folded her hands together, considering Daniel carefully. That is a rare answer, she said quietly. Daniel lifted an eyebrow. Admitting you do not know something? Olivia nodded. Most people with impressive careers spend their time pretending they know everything already. Daniel chuckled softly at that. While that sounds exhausting. Olivia looked down briefly at the tablecloth, tracing the faint pattern with her fingertips before looking back up at him. Sometimes it is. The honesty in her voice caught Daniel off guard for a moment. He had expected confidence from someone with her background. He had expected polished answers and practiced conversation. What he had not expected was the calm sincerity that seemed to slip into every sentence she spoke. For a moment he studied her again the way he had earlier, quietly searching for the reason she had truly come tonight. Not the polite explanation. The real one. Olivia seemed to notice the question forming in his expression. She leaned forward slightly, resting her arms gently on the edge of the table. Can I tell you the other thing I noticed that day in the park? She asked. Daniel nodded once. Olivia spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. When your son finally kicked the ball correctly, you did not cheer like you had been waiting for that moment all afternoon. Daniel looked curious. What did I do? Olivia smiled faintly. You clapped once and said, "Good, now do it again." Daniel stared at her for a second, then laughed quietly under his breath. That sounds like something I would say. Olivia nodded again. You made success look like the beginning of the work, not the end of it. Around the table, Marcus leaned back in his chair with a soft whistle under his breath. Daniel shook his head slowly, still smiling a little. You really were paying attention that day. Olivia met his eyes calmly. Yes, she said, because men like you are harder to find than most people realize. Daniel did not answer Olivia immediately after her last sentence, and the silence that followed felt deeper than any pause earlier that evening. The words she had spoken did not sound exaggerated or dramatic, yet they carried a weight that settled slowly across the table. Daniel had spent most of his adult life avoiding compliments that sounded too large for the life he lived. He worked long hours in a school transportation garage, came home with grease on his hands, helped his son with homework at the kitchen table, and repeated the same routine again the next day. No one had ever described that life as rare. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and glanced toward the window again, watching the faint glow of traffic lights move across the glass. For a moment, he looked like a man measuring the distance between two different worlds. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, but there was a trace of quiet disbelief beneath it. You might be the first person who has ever said something like that about a mechanic who spends half his day under a bus engine. Olivia did not smile in a playful way. Instead, she gave a small, thoughtful nod. That is because most people are not paying attention to the right things, she replied. Marcus shifted in his chair again, clearly fascinated by the direction the evening had taken. What began as a casual setup now felt like something closer to an unexpected interview about Daniel's life. Except the tone was not judgmental. It was curious. Daniel folded his arms loosely across his chest, studying Olivia again with the same patient attention he gave complicated machines when they did not behave the way he expected. You said men like me are harder to find, he said slowly. What exactly does that mean? Olivia took a small breath before answering. Her eyes remained steady on his, calm but direct. It means you did not look at your son like he was a responsibility you had to carry. You looked at him like he was someone you were building. The sentence settled across the table like a quiet echo. Daniel blinked once, surprised by the precision of her words. Olivia continued gently. In my work, I meet many people who are successful by every traditional measurement. They build companies. They run investment firms. They manage large teams of employees. But when they talk about their families, they sound distracted, like it is a side project they do not quite understand. Daniel tilted his head slightly. And you think teaching a kid how to kick a soccer ball is somehow more impressive than that? Olivia shook her head slowly. Not more impressive, she said. More honest. Daniel let out a soft breath through his nose, half amused and half thoughtful. Around the table, his friends had completely stopped pretending to be casual observers. Marcus rested his elbows on the table and watched the conversation like someone witnessing a story he would later retell many times. Daniel glanced at him briefly before returning his attention to Olivia. I am still not convinced that is enough reason for someone like you to show up tonight, he said calmly. Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair, the warm restaurant lights reflecting faintly across her expression. For the first time that evening, there was a small pause before she answered. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that made the entire table still again. It was not the only reason I came. Daniel held Olivia's gaze after her last sentence, and for a moment the soft noise of the restaurant seemed to fade again into the background. His expression did not change dramatically, but the calm patience in his eyes sharpened slightly. He had spent years learning that when someone paused before telling the full truth, the next words usually mattered more than the first ones. Daniel rested his hands on the table again, fingers loosely interlocked, and waited. Around them his friends had grown unusually quiet. Marcus leaned back in his chair but did not interrupt, and one of the others slowly set his glass down as if he did not want the sound to break the moment. Olivia noticed the attention but did not look away from Daniel. The warm light above the table softened the edges of the room, leaving the two of them almost isolated in the center of the quiet conversation. She took a slow breath before continuing. When I saw you in the park, she said calmly, I noticed something else. Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly, inviting her to continue. Olivia spoke carefully, as though the memory was still clear in her mind. After your son finally managed to kick the ball straight, he ran in a circle around you like he had just won the World Cup. Daniel laughed softly under his breath. That definitely sounds like Marcus Jr. Olivia nodded. But you did not celebrate right away. You watched him first. Daniel tilted his head slightly, curious. Watched him. Olivia nodded again. You watched him run back toward you. And before he even said anything, you knelt down so you were at the same height as him. Daniel's expression shifted slightly as the memory returned in more detail. Olivia continued. You told him you were proud of him, but you also reminded him that learning takes time and patience. Your voice was calm. There was no pressure in it. No frustration. Marcus leaned forward slightly as if he could see the scene forming in his mind. Daniel glanced briefly toward him before returning his attention to Olivia. Most parents do something like that, Daniel said modestly. Olivia shook her head gently. Not the way you did. The table grew quiet again. Olivia rested her hands lightly against the tablecloth and continued in the same thoughtful tone. In my world, people talk constantly about leadership, about strategy, about building things that last. But the truth is most of them cannot explain how patience actually works. Daniel listened carefully, the same steady attention he gave to every word spoken throughout the evening. Olivia met his eyes again. That day in the park I realized something very simple, she said. Daniel waited. Olivia's voice softened just slightly. If a man can teach patience to a child that naturally, he probably carries it into every other part of his life. Daniel studied her face, thoughtful but calm. For the first time that evening, he seemed less skeptical and more curious. He leaned back slowly in his chair, considering her words. You came to this dinner because of that observation? He asked quietly. Olivia smiled faintly. Partly. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, the hint of a smile appearing at the corner of his mouth again. You mentioned there was another reason. Olivia nodded once more. For a brief moment, she glanced toward Marcus and the others at the table, then back to Daniel. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm certainty that had shifted the entire evening earlier. Yes, she said gently. Because the friends who arranged this dinner left out one important detail when they invited me. Daniel did not speak right away after Olivia said that the invitation had left out an important detail. The words hung quietly above the table like the final note of a song that had not quite finished yet. Around them, the restaurant continued its soft rhythm, plates clinking gently in the distance, a low hum of conversation drifting across the room. But at their table, the silence felt focused and deliberate. Daniel rested his hands loosely against the table and studied Olivia with the same careful attention he had shown all evening. What detail would that be? He asked calmly. Olivia smiled slightly, though it was not the playful kind of smile people use during small talk. It was thoughtful, almost amused by the situation that had unfolded. She glanced briefly toward Marcus and the others at the table, who suddenly looked far less confident than they had when the evening began. Then she returned her attention to Daniel. When they told me about you, she said slowly, they described a hard-working single father who spends his days repairing school buses and his evenings raising a son. Daniel nodded once. That part is accurate. Olivia continued, her tone steady. They also said the date was meant to be lighthearted, a harmless joke between friends. Marcus shifted in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck, clearly realizing he was now part of the story being told. Olivia's eyes softened slightly before she spoke again. But they forgot to mention something important. Daniel leaned back slightly, curious now rather than skeptical. Olivia met his gaze without hesitation. They forgot to mention that you are the kind of man who makes ordinary moments look meaningful. The words settled quietly across the table. Daniel blinked once, surprised by the simplicity of the statement. Olivia continued before he could respond. Most people believe impressive lives are built from dramatic events. Big promotions, expensive houses, important titles. But when I watched you with your son in the park, I realized something different. Daniel listened carefully, his expression calm but attentive. Olivia spoke with quiet certainty. You were building something much more difficult than that. You were building character. Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair with a soft breath, and one of the other men shook his head slightly, as if trying to process how far the evening had traveled from the joke they originally planned. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of his watch again, thoughtful. That sounds like a very generous interpretation of a father teaching his kid how to kick a soccer ball. Olivia shook her head gently. No, she said. It sounds like someone who understands that patience is more powerful than pressure. Daniel looked down for a moment, then back up again. There was a quiet warmth in his expression now, the kind that appears when someone hears something sincere they did not expect. The tension that had filled the beginning of the evening had completely disappeared, replaced by something calmer and more genuine. After a moment, Daniel gave a small nod. Well, he said slowly, that might be the first time anyone has ever complimented my parenting strategy during a blind date. Olivia laughed softly, the sound light but real. Daniel leaned forward slightly and rested his forearms on the table again. His voice remained calm, but there was a trace of curiosity now that had not been there earlier. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, he said. You agreed to a dinner that my friends expected to last 5 awkward minutes because you once watched my son miss a soccer ball in a public park. Olivia's smile returned, steady and confident. Yes, she said simply. Daniel studied her for another second, then shook his head slowly with a quiet laugh. Well, he said, that might be the most unusual beginning to a conversation I have ever experienced. Olivia met his eyes with calm certainty. Sometimes, she replied gently, the best conversations begin exactly that way.